Maraming salamat po, Professor Eileen S.P. Baviera. Okay, now we go to the main fair. The first to speak at this forum is Undersecretary Jose Luis Chito Gascon, who represents the Office of the Presidential Advisor on Political Affairs and also represents the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process. Sa Undersecretary Gascon, please.
Thank you very much, Malu, for the introduction. I'm here on behalf of Secretary Deles, the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, although I'm not officially or technically part of that office. I'm with a separate office that works with the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, and that's the Office for Political Affairs. So I am wearing two hats here. Sometimes that's the confusion. Opa ba si Chito o Opa? So, or Papa. I'm with Political Affairs, but working on the peace issues, assisting the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process. I'm grateful to the organizers for organizing this public forum. I think it's important that we're able to surface the issues and to focus on what our host spoke about earlier, causes, consequences, and moving forward. And we look forward to a conversation, a dialogue that will help identify solutions. I cannot speak about the events ongoing in Zamboanga because, of course, it is a crisis situation, a security matter, and there are other offices in government that are in charge about the operational details of dealing with the crisis. What I am prepared to share with us is maybe the larger context involving the peace process itself. We are aware that there are fundamental problems relating to conflict in Mindanao in general, but in particular in the areas where we have a significant Muslim population, and that moral question has been a problem facing this country for decades. And what the Philippine government is currently doing is pursuing a policy of the primacy of the peace process, and all agencies of government, including the security forces, the armed forces of the Philippines, and the National Police are engaged and committed to the primacy of that process. We have two tables that are open with regard to the moral question. There is the negotiation table with the MILF. The peace negotiations with the MILF have had its starts and spurts over the last decade. But since the appointment of the panel under the administration of President Aquino in 2010, we have had significant progress at that end. In fact, as was already announced, there is a forum next month here on that process. I guess the organizers decided to organize it next month because next month marks the first year anniversary of the signing of the framework agreement for the Bangsamoro, or the FAB. That framework agreement was the result of that process that began under the administration of President Aquino, under chairs former Dean Marvic Lon, and now Justice of the Supreme Court, and Professor Miriam Coronel Ferrer, both of whom are, of course, very much connected with the university. And that table continues. In fact, the day that the siege in Zamboanga occurred was the day that members of both panels were traveling to Kuala Lumpur to begin their 40th round of exploratory talks. They finished the 48th round. It was one of the longest rounds of this current negotiation, over 10 days of negotiations, and have come home and are preparing for the 41st round, yet the siege continues. So of course this is something that we are very well aware of, and it's in the back of our minds. There is a second table, but that is not a negotiating table. It is a review table, and that is the table with the MNLF. Now, you might ask, why is it not a negotiating table? The basic reason why it is not a negotiating table is because negotiations with the MNLF had been completed 17 years ago, in 1996, with the signing of the final peace agreement. So I think that is something we should not forget. There is a decades-long problem, and there have been several efforts at trying to address the core issues of that problem. But with respect to the MNLF had undertaken a process of negotiations with former governments, and in fact signed a final peace agreement in 1996. So one of the core issues or problems here is it possible for a rebel group that has already signed a peace agreement to continue to maintain its weapons and to use it whenever there are issues, disputes, conflicts, etc.? And of course, the whole purpose of a peace agreement is to establish the mechanisms for resolving your differences, as differences will continue, in a way or manner outside of employing means of war or violence. So I think that's a core issue and problem. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is other than the integration of several qualified elements of the MNLF into the armed forces, which was provided for in the final peace agreement, the final peace agreement itself did not provide for what to do with those that will not be integrated into the armed forces. 2020 vision, hindsight, perhaps that's something that we should address now. And in fact, that was tabled already for discussion in the MILF process under what we refer to as the Annex on Normalization. So even before the crisis had happened, by the time that the framework agreement had been signed last year, normalization, or in international speak, DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, has been placed on the agenda. And hopefully, as we move forward with the peace process with the MILF, we might be able to fully resolve issues involving the facts on the ground of the proliferation of weapons in the hands of those who shouldn't be wielding them in the first place. Now, even if I say there is no negotiations with the MNLF as such because of the signing of the final peace agreement, there is a review table, and it is a review table that has been open from 7 years back. 10 years after the signing of the final peace agreement in 1996, by 2006, there was a discussion at the highest levels in government as well as in consultations with the OIC that it might be opportune to review the implementation of that final peace agreement. And so the last 7 years from 2007 continuing, we have what is referred to as the tripartite review process. It's called tripartite because it involves the government, the MNLF, including Mr. Miswari, and the OIC, under the auspices of what's called the Peace Committee for Southern Philippines. The Peace Committee for Southern Philippines is an OIC body composed of OIC members, and they have been providing the space for the two parties to the final peace agreement to review the implementation of that agreement. And again, over the last few years under the Aquino administration, there has also been progress involving that review panel to the extent that at this point in time, there is what is referred to as 42 consensus points, meaning both the agreement and the law, the organic law, RA 9054, which established the ARM, had been subjected to a thorough assessment, review, consultation process, and the 42 consensus points, meaning a consensus between both the MNLF and the government, had been arrived about certain amendments that will have to take place in the ARM, as well as certain actions that must be taken within the existing government mechanisms to address some of the concerns from that review. There were, belatedly after, towards the end of that process, there were three other issues that had been tabled. One has to do with what's called strategic minerals, what to do with strategic minerals, which is referred to in the RA 9054, and the issue of plebiscite and provisional government, which Mr. Miswari had tabled. And it was in those two of the three new issues where there was a divergence of opinion between the MNLF and the government at the tripartite review process. It was the position taken by the MNLF that reference to provisional government in the final peace agreement had not yet been implemented, while the government took the position that provisional government had actually already been implemented under phase 1 of the final peace agreement. That refers to the establishment of the SPCPD, the Southern Philippine Council for Peace and Development, of which Nor Miswari was named chair during the Ramos administration, as well as the assumption to office as governor of ARM of Mr. Miswari himself. So that provision was, from the point of view of government, fully implemented already, but Mr. Miswari took a different position, that provisional government had yet not been implemented. And the other was with respect to plebiscite. It was the position taken by the MNLF that there must be another plebiscite that should be conducted about the area. But the position of government was that this was already resolved by the plebiscite that was undertaken on the organic law 9054. So there was a divergence in position between the MNLF and the government about whether or not provisional government and plebiscite had already been implemented or not. And now, on hindsight, I think these are probably some of the differences of opinion and the positions taken by Mr. Miswari on those two issues perhaps have spurred him to consider to take other approaches. Nonetheless, it's our position that resort to force and violence has no place, in the context of two parties that have already penned a peace agreement. And also, especially because that table had not in fact been closed. The table remained open, and just for the record, on the 1st of September, in Zamboanga City, several MNLF leaders gathered in Zamboanga in anticipation of the next tripartite review process and passed a resolution expressing support, continuing support for the final peace agreement. And asking for participation in the tripartite review process, which had been scheduled for 2 weeks from that date, on the 16th of September. After that event in Zamboanga, where the MNLF leaders had been consulted, the OPAP was given a copy of that resolution, and we had met on the 5th of September with the chair of the Peace Committee for Southern Philippines. Indonesia currently chairs the Peace Committee and has been for the last few years as the tripartite review has been ongoing. But this November, the intention of the OIC is that they will transfer the chairmanship of the Peace Committee for Southern Philippines to Egypt. So Egypt will be the new chair of the Peace Committee. And on the 5th of September, we had met with the representatives of Indonesia who were chairing the Peace Committee and actually provided some feedback. One was that we were prepared to proceed to Yogyakarta for the scheduled date of the tripartite review, which was 16th of September, and that the certain MNLF leaders wanted to participate in that process, and we gave them a copy of that resolution. The response was fairly simple, that the process was open, but that the representation of the MNLF in the tripartite review would be under what is referred to as the JEDA formula. Now, the JEDA formula was an approach taken by the OIC to deal with the problem of division within the ranks of the MNLF, because there are recognizable factions. And so under the JEDA formula system, Mr. Miswari, as chair of the MNLF, sits as well as other people representing his group, and the leadership of what's called the Executive Committee of the MNLF, with Muslimin Sema as the recognized leader thereof, also sitting as well. So even in the tripartite review process, there is an attempt to make it inclusive, that not only one voice but all voices in the MNLF will have a seat at the table in the tripartite review. So that was the response of Indonesia, that they will take into account the resolution asking for participation from other MNLF leaders, but it will have to be arranged within what's called the JEDA formula. Now, we were all ready to proceed to Yogyakarta on the 16th, but the events of the 9th of September prevailed upon the situation, and now the Yogyakarta tripartite review process has had to be rescheduled. Now, I think there will have to be consultations between the parties, whether or not it's still opportune to proceed with that review. Of course, the government takes the position that there is a standing peace agreement with the MLF. It's not personal to Mr. Miswari alone. Therefore, we hold all the parties to that agreement to account for the implementation of that agreement, and we are prepared to work with all people of goodwill committed to the peace, who are ready to sit down and talk about the implementation thereof. Now, I was at a forum with Grace yesterday, initiated by the Philippine Council for Islam and Democracy. One of the issues that emerged while I was there was that perhaps there is a miscommunication or a misunderstanding of the facts and the situation that has probably contributed to the events as we see them now. And that is possible. As I said, there is a divergence of position between Mr. Miswari and the government about the issue of provisional government and plebiscite. And there was probably also a difference of perspective about what the tripartite review process will achieve. Because the position of government is that the tripartite review process was reviewing an already settled final peace agreement to see how far we have gone in terms of pursuing it. It was not, and is not from the point of view of the government, an opportunity or a forum for renegotiating a new deal. And I think that should be clear. No? We were not taking a position that anything in the final peace agreement could be renegotiated. We can discuss about whether or not it has been fully implemented, but we were not in a position to renegotiate anything with the MNLF. And perhaps there were those who viewed the tripartite review as in fact a mechanism to renegotiate. But the terms of reference of the tripartite review were clear. That was not the purpose. But second, perhaps the miscommunication perhaps or the divergence of position was that what were we anticipating as we were coming into the next round of the tripartite review? The Philippine government, and we had told Indonesia this, was going to formally manifest at the meeting in Yogyakarta what it had already indicated previously in two separate note verbals from Secretary of Foreign Affairs de Rosario to the OIC, that the Philippine government was prepared after 7 years of a review process and arrival at the 42 consensus points to terminate the review of the final peace agreement. While that was the position we were taking, that did not mean termination of the engagement with the MNLF. What we were prepared to do was to recommend that after 7 years, it's probably time to finish the review process and to proceed on the consensus points. Perhaps there was misunderstanding or misassessment on the part of other parties to think that if we were to take a position to terminate the review, that would be the end of that table. But the reality was we were already talking with Indonesia about other mechanisms for continuing engagement with the MNLF, particularly because one of the outputs of the tripartite review process was what we refer to as the solo understanding. The solo understanding was the result of a meeting held last year, a year and a half ago rather, in Solo, Indonesia, where both the MNLF and the government agreed to what was called partnership, and this is the quote from the document, partnership on governance reform. Because at the time of the Solo meeting of the tripartite review, government had just postponed the elections of the arm and was anticipating to appoint an OIC government, which eventually was Mujib Hataman and the rest of his team at the arm. At the time of the meeting in Solo, the appointments had not been made, but the postponement of the election had already occurred. And at the Solo meeting, the Solo understanding was made that MNLF and the government would form a partnership for armed governance reform. And to implement that, several members of the MNLF had actually been invited into and had accepted positions of responsibility under the OIC government of Mujib Hataman. We were working on implementation of already certain reform agenda as well as the 42 consensus points even at that time. And so what we had prepared to do was that as we terminated the review, we were prepared to continue to engage and consult with MNLF as well as with other stakeholders for Mindanao on engagement on governance reform under the administration of President Aquino. Why 1 week before a scheduled Yogyakarta meeting, a faction of the MNLF decides to march into Zamboanga with arms? That is a matter I cannot speculate on. It will have to be something they will have to clarify. But our position is that there was enough space and continuing space for peaceful resolution of whatever concerns or disputes that may occur. And just to highlight this point, let me refer back to the other table, the MILF negotiating table. We are anticipating finishing the negotiation phase of that process, because the framework agreement speaks of the comprehensive compact, including the FAP and 4 annexes. We have completed 2 of the 4, and we are in the final stages of completing the other 2, the annex on power sharing and the annex on normalization. Once the 4 annexes are completed, we would have finished the negotiation phase with the MILF. The next phase will be the rest of the roadmap outlined in the FAB. Drafting of a new basic law that will replace the ARM by the Transition Commission. Congressional action to enact the basic law, the Bangsamoro Basic Law. A plebiscite that will be held in the area. And then the abolishing of the ARM and replacing it with a new Bangsamoro political entity, and the appointment of a transition authority prior to an election for the regular Bangsamoro government, together with the regular election scheduled in 2016. So that's where we are going, and it is actually something that both government and the MILF are conscious of, that process will have to be inclusive, because we're talking about the same area and the same people, and we cannot have 2 separate institutions, the ARM and the Bangsamoro. So we have been talking about convergence, meaning to say the MNLF process, the MILF process, as well as the governance reform in the ARM will at a certain point converge for the area. And we are seeing that happen from the time of the end of the negotiations with the MILF and the triggering of the Transition Commission process. In fact, the Transition Commission had already been appointed, and we had conducted consultations with the MNLF and had in fact even asked Mr. Miswari to nominate people into the Transition Commission before the Transition Commission had been appointed. But the MNLF demurred and did not nominate anyone from their ranks to the Transition Commission. Nonetheless, we vetted the names to the Transition Commission, and several people, there are 15 members of the Transition Commission, 8 nominated by the MILF and 7 by the government. Of the 15, 6 of them come from the island groups, Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi. And we did inquire if the people who would sit there would be able to consult with and represent the views of the MNLF, even if they were not nominated by the MNLF directly. We were assured of that fact. And so there is enough voice in the Transition Commission for the concerns that the MNLF might have. And we are prepared, as I said, as we terminate the tripartite review process, we are prepared to engage with the MNLF and other stakeholders, so long as there is a good faith interest in the peace process. So that's where we are. Again, I will not speak about the events itself unfolding in Zamboanga. That is something other persons are more competent in discussing. But what I wish to highlight is that it was completely unnecessary to resort to violence under the circumstances that are prevailing prior to and up to this point in time as it relates to the government and the MNLF. Thank you very much. Magandang umaga po sa inyo.